Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drum McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at thechangeleader.com. This episode of Changing Higher Ed is sponsored by Predatory Education, a national leader in online student recruitment and enrollment services, providing institutions enrolled students risk-free on a performance-based model with no long-term contract. If your online programs could benefit from incremental online student enrollments, visit PerdiaEducation.com. That's PERDIA education.com. And now, here's your host, Drum McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Our guest today is Mike Goldstein, Managing Director of the Center for Higher Education Transformation at Titan Partners. Mike is a pioneer in the development of the legal environment in higher education and a counselor at the highest levels of legislation. He founded the law firm Dow Loans in 1978, which merged into Cooley in 2014, and was a senior partner there for 7 years before moving to Titan. Mike is joining us today to discuss the election and its possible implications for higher education under a Biden administration. Mike, welcome to the show. Great to have you back.
Well, thank you, Joe. I'm delighted to be here.
A lot of changes back in your area, the country, back in Washington, D.C. How's the climate back there?
Oh, the sun is shining, the birds are singing, the trees are still green and leaf. It's just lovely and amazing transformation. Actually, it was interesting. I was on Saturday. I was walking on the grounds of the National Cathedral with my wife and my son, daughter-in-law, and my grandbaby. And all of a sudden, all our phones started buzzing. And everyone around me, and myself included, looked, and it said that Pennsylvania had just been called for Biden. And this great cheer came up. All of us reacted just about the same way, that this was a miraculous occurrence. You have to realize that D.C. went about 96% for Joe Biden, so there were not a lot of long faces on the grounds of the cathedral. But I think it does indicate people's sense that there is going to be a significant transformation in how this country goes forward, even with divided government. And what happens in education is a not insignificant part of that.
I fully agree. It's one of those things when you read his plan for education beyond high school and its promise to strengthen college as a reliable pathway to the middle class. I mean, that says it all to me.
Well, I think the general principle, no one would argue, and I think Republican or Democrat. I think where the difference will come in is what is intended, what this actually means. It really has two components. One is the general acceptance that education, and particularly higher education, has to be faster and better and less expensive. There's kind of general acceptance of that. But there's also, I think, increasing acceptance that it has to be more accessible. It has to be more accessible to people of color. It has to be more accessible to first generation, people whose families do not have a history of going to college, of people coming out of lower income backgrounds. And that means more than simply reducing the cost of education. It also means doing more, not just to admit students, but to get them through so that they have the credential they need to then succeed in life. And that's critical. Just increasing the number in the front door isn't going to help if we're not giving students the opportunity to come back out clutching that credential.
And the credential has to be something that's meaningful to employers, so that changes in many respects the focus of many programs, or the foci of many programs. It also provides more for students in the way of counseling, in the way of admissions, helping them through, because many of these folks, we're asking them to get up to a higher level of education, and it's something they're not familiar with, and they need a little bit of hand-holding going through.
Well, I think it's more than just counseling and hand-holding. I think we also have to address the fact that there is a disconnect between what is taught in most institutions and what employers are looking for. There has been for many, many years, and this goes back to when I was a university administrator many years ago, that you ask faculty, are you preparing students for the workplace? And the answer is uniformly yes. 85, 90% of faculty say, yes, we're doing a great job of that. And then you ask employers, and that number drops down to about 40%. And that disconnect has been there forever. I think there is a recognition now that part of it is a failure of the business community and the higher education community to effectively communicate in terms of what is needed, how to make that what is needed part of the curriculum, and what role business has to play in working with institutions to ensure that students who graduate are ready for the workforce, are ready to be successful in the workforce. And I think this administration talks about that in terms of providing paid internships, to having degree-related on-the-job training, to providing pathways, sequences of courses that support specific areas of study. So I think that's in what President-elect Biden has already said is part of what he's looking to do.
You and I have talked before, colleges and universities need to look at themselves more as part of the talent supply chain. And that is one of the major disconnects, because faculty don't really understand what that means or how to operationalize it, how to really train. This is another reason why we're seeing so many of these micro credentials and stackable certificates coming out that are work much more closely with business to train graduates and sending people back to college.
Well, and what one could argue is that a course should really be a set of stackable credentials. A degree should be a pile of stackable credentials that add up to, in addition to these set of competencies. This, by the way, was the fundamental premise behind Western Governors University, that you put together these stackable credentials, these competencies, and then they reach a certain point where they also constitute what will give you a bachelor's degree or a master's degree or an associate's degree. So the degree is essentially the aggregation of a set of marketable competencies. And I think that's where we are now heading. And I think we are going to have an administration which will have leadership in the Department of Education and the Department of Commerce and the Department of Labor that are going to work together to develop these kinds of programs.
And of course, they're going to have to get the Senate on board. But if you're talking about creating more jobs, I think that's going to be a way to do that.
Well, I think the first thing is to get a consensus as to what we're trying to do. I think the notion of accessibility, of making higher education affordable, improving the student aid programs, reducing debt burden on all students. Ironically, the problem with regard to debt burden is uniquely a middle-class problem. The least affluent students essentially get a free ride. But as one moves away from that and moves into the middle-class categories, as one gets away from that and moves into the middle-class categories, you can see where the debt burden increases almost exponentially. And we have to get away from that. And again, in reading the president-elect's plans, in listening to what people are saying, I think that's a significant part of what we're seeking to do.
Now, Mike, one of the two platforms, and you broke it down very nicely when we were talking before, was the basic premise of Biden's program is expanding access and improving throughput. And now let's focus a little bit on how he would like to expand access to higher education.
Well, I think he's got several components here, and one is we talked about earlier was making enrollment in community colleges or similar training organizations. A student can go through that program debt-free. So a combination of reduced tuition and grants, whether they're state grants or federal grants. And he is proposing in his plan that there would be 75% federal funding. That, of course, depends upon what the Congress is willing to support. But I think the premise of free 2-year education, they get the associate degree, is essentially like high school. It's a right. I think is a fundamental premise. I think an important one. Another component is particularly supporting minority-serving institutions, and that includes the historically black colleges and universities, but it includes a lot of other institutions. First of all, minority-serving includes Hispanic-serving institutions serving other minority populations, Native Americans and others. The HBCUs are really important institutions. They provide an exceptional service. They provide an ability for people to really gain a high-quality education in an extraordinarily supportive environment. There aren't that many of them, and they don't, in the aggregate, enroll all that many students. But they're critically important because they really pull along everybody else. And I think support to HBCUs, support to minority-serving institutions is really critical. And again, I think that's a high priority for the administration.
Well, the idea of access is critical, and it's not only admissions, there's the support that's necessary that goes on with that. But this is not unlike what we were talking about earlier with the costs. The state universities of New York and city universities of New York, but even the California colleges, they were founded on the premise of a free or very low cost education.
Yeah, I mean, the California system, the New York City system, most of the Western universities, a lot of the state universities in the East, the premise was that this was education for everyone and there would be access for everyone. And we lost that, and we lost that for reasons that were not in control of the educators. And I think that we have a movement back in the direction of education for all beyond high school and making it affordable. But also the point that you made, Drum, is really important. It's not just making it affordable. It's not just having access. It's ensuring that individuals who enroll are able to complete, that they have the support, the counseling, they have childcare, which is critically important. The average student is not the 18 to 22-year-old any longer. The average student is an adult who has child responsibilities, who has parental care responsibilities, who has work responsibilities. And we need to create an educational system that is accessible for everyone who wants and needs access. So that is a wide range of support, and that support costs money. It's nice to say we're going to make it accessible, but it's like saying we're going to take away stairs and put up a ramp, but by the way, you've got to buy your own motorized wheelchair. You have to have all the components in place.
Mike, I think we're going to expect a lot of changes from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. We've talked about some of those things already, but I think there's some other things that are going to come into play as well. Title IX, I think the changes that have happened to Title IX, a lot of them are going to be rolled back. It's my sense.
I think that's inevitable. I think, ironically, the DeVos administration, the department, got it partly right on Title IX. There was an imbalance. The rights of individuals in terms of the protections that are supposed to be afforded by Title IX were not being well served. But part of that was that the institutions really lacked appropriate guidance as to how to deal with issues of both abuse and discrimination. The problem with where the administration went with that was to flip it very heavily in the opposite direction. And I think there is a balance to be struck. One has to protect the rights of individuals who suffer from sexual misconduct or abuse, from discrimination. There also has to be a process that is fair. And that's a very delicate balance. And institutions are rather badly equipped at the moment to understand how to do that. I mean, it's not a question of not wanting to do the right thing. It's really not having the resources, the human resources, to do this properly. And what I think this administration will focus on is coming up with a balanced system that gives institutions the tools to enable them to properly administer these programs and administer the law. I mean, the regulations are intended to flesh out what is a legal obligation. I think this administration will be much more sensitive to ensuring protection of the individual who has suffered, but also ensuring that the process is fair and reasonable and reasonably expeditious. People are entitled to a determination in a reasonable period of time.
I fully agree. And I also think that we're going to see this expand. Not only are there going to be better processes in place, we're going to see it go beyond just university-owned buildings to communities involving university people. And hopefully it will cost less to implement than it certainly does now.
I'm a little bit torn on the issue of how far the jurisdiction of Title IX should go. There is a limit to how much authority an institution should exercise over its population. I think the question that we want to think about is, what's the responsibility of an employer, for example, for conduct that occurs outside of the workplace? And I think there's a similar situation with regard to a university. The fact that someone is a student and engages in conduct off campus, if that conduct is in any way criminal, that's a civil issue. That should not be an institutional issue. If it is morally repugnant, if it is repugnant relative to the conduct of the institution, the same way an employer has the right to say an individual shouldn't be here because that individual has engaged in morally repugnant conduct, I think an institution has the same right. But I think we've got to be careful that we don't say that you've got 20,000 students on your campus and you are now responsible for the conduct of those 20,000 students, no matter where they are and what they're doing. If they're on a field trip, if they're on a study abroad program that is under the jurisdiction of the institution, then absolutely it's the institution's responsibility. If they're off somewhere away from the campus, not under the responsibility of the campus, or not in a fraternity house, for example, that's off campus, but it's still essentially a part of the institution. I think we've got to be very careful about extending that responsibility, because that becomes a slippery slope in terms of how that's implemented and how that is reasonably enforced, whether it can be enforced. The worst thing we can do is set up expectations for legal protection and then fail to implement that protection. If we're going to do it, we have to be able to do it.
It's just like a pendulum. It goes slam against one side, it slams against the other side, and eventually it comes to some sort of equilibrium in the middle to where it's as fair as it can be to as many different parties as possible.
Yeah, it never quite sticks in the middle, and we understand that. I mean, that's the democratic process. I mean, there is a balancing of interests, and I think that, frankly, if the pendulum has to be tilted one way or the other, it should be tilted in favor of the person who's been harmed. I think that if you're going to err, I think you should err somewhat on the side of the person who has been harmed, certainly in terms of the opportunity to fully and fairly express their concern and their facts. But there does have to be balance. I mean, we are dealing with people, and we're dealing typically with young people who are on all sides, should be not only treated fairly, but also protected on all sides.
Very true. Swapping subjects, some of the for-profit regulations have been set aside by the DeVos department. I'm kind of expecting a lot of these things are going to be brought back, maybe in a different way. What do you think?
I think part of the question is, how do you state it? If the issue is whether this administration is going to be more active in pursuing predatory for-profit colleges, I think the answer to that is absolutely right. I think the critical word there is not for-profit. The critical word there is predatory.
Yes, I agree.
I think any institution that acts inappropriately, that misrepresents what it's doing, that fails to properly safeguard the use of federal funds, that fails to provide the educational service that it promises, should suffer the consequences. It has unfortunately been the case that the poster children for that kind of conduct have been for-profit institutions, and most of the worst offenders, maybe all of the worst offenders, are no longer with us. I think that the for-profit colleges play an important role. If you look at certain fields of study, cosmetology, I mean, one needs cosmetologists, one needs welders, one needs nurse anesthesiologists. The for-profit schools do a good job in training for that. There are for-profit institutions that are very good degree-granting institutions.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the instinct should not be, do we crack down on for-profit colleges? I think the emphasis should be on ensuring that every institution, including for-profit colleges, behave properly, work within the rules. And where they do not, they should be sanctioned. And where they do not, students should be protected from harm. So if a school, be it for-profit or nonprofit, and the borrower defense rules apply uniformly across all institutions, if a school suddenly folds for whatever reason, the students should have recourse. And the rules that provide a student with a refund of their loans if a school suddenly collapses are applied evenly and should be. The rules that give a student an opportunity to get recompense if they were improperly recruited, if they were improperly served, apply to all institutions, and they need to be applied fairly and forcefully. I think one of the problems with this administration has not been that they've ignored predatory for-profit institutions. They've essentially walked away from enforcement. I think that the department's obligation is not as the arbiter of educational quality. That's something that is historically, since the founding of the Republic, the responsibility of the states. But they should be aggressively ensuring that the federal funds that are used to support education are used properly, and where that is not the case, taking appropriate action.
I fully agree with that. I think we'll see some changes. I think we'll see the VA funding of education get rolled into 90-10. That'll depend a lot of what the Senate does, but I think we're going to see some changes in that. And I think you're right. It's the enforcement. It just hasn't been done.
Yeah. And the 90-10 rule, and that's that at least 10% of tuition revenue has to be derived from non-federal student aid sources. And the one of the suggestions is that funds coming from the VA, the GI Bill, be included in that 10%. There's another proposal to increase the non-federal share from 10% to 15%. Those are useful. I think, again, if you look at quality for-profit institutions, they don't have 90-10 problems. I think that's a minority of institutions. I'm not sure that this is actually a good indicator of institutional quality. It's like we said for many years, the cohort default rate is a critical indicator of whether it's a good school. If students default it's obviously not a good school. And there have been multiple studies that say it's absolutely unrelated to the quality of education. It's related to a lot of other factors, but not quality of education. 90-10 is indicative of the socioeconomic class of the students being served. If an institution is serving a large number of lower income students, they're going to have a higher proportion of federal funds. Do we want to discourage quality education for lower income students because they're taking advantage of federal funds? I think not. I think there are other better ways of policing quality of education than by using an inferential factor like 90-10.
I fully agree. Well, Mike, we're getting to the end of our time here. I think we're going to see a lot of changes. We've talked about many of them. I think it's going to depend a lot on how soon Biden can spin things up. The transition is obviously a challenge at this point. Control of the Senate is going to make a big difference, but we'll see.
I think the critical issue is what happens with CARES Act 3. I think it's absolutely essential that there is a large infusion of funds to the states and to institutions, both public institutions and nonprofit institutions, and I think the good for-profit institutions as well, absolutely need funding to enable them to sustain themselves across this transition, which is going to be, probably close to another year. We have theoretically, there is a vaccine now that works. Pfizer says they'll have 10 to 15 million doses by the end of the year. That is a tiny number. We need, if we're going to inoculate enough of the American public, we need somewhere on the order of 500 to 600 million doses just for the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to take time. So there's going to be still a period where we're going to be working under a very different environment, higher cost, lower enrollment, and the federal government is the only place that can step in and say, we're going to provide the funds to carry across this so that we come out the other end. And fortunately, everything looks like we will be coming out the other end. That institutions don't, in the interim, crash and burn. And right now, the thing that really concerns me is the number of institutions, particularly private colleges, that were in a weakened financial situation going into the pandemic and are now teetering on the brink. And we have to protect for that, because otherwise the disruption to higher education in this country is going to be extraordinary.
I fully agree. So given all these changes, 3 takeaways you tell higher ed presidents, higher ed boards that they should be thinking about, or prognostications going forward?
Well, one is think faster, better, cheaper. Think how we can improve not just the quality of education, but also the way it's delivered and the cost of delivery. And I'm separating cost from price, because we want to lower the price, but in order to lower the price, there has to be a way to reduce the cost as well as providing other sources of support. I think we have to do everything we can to make the system more fair, more accessible. We have a changing population, and we have to reach out to everyone in that population. We have to provide a way to retrain the coal miner in West Virginia. It's the same way we have to help the immigrants coming into this country who have a less than adequate education to be able to prosper. And I think we have to go back to the notion that education and higher education is a public good, that it is something that at the end of the day benefits everyone in the country, and we need to be willing to give it the support that enables us to have, and this was a national goal for a long time, and I think we've lost sight of it, is that we should be the most highly educated country in the world. We've got a lot of competition, and right now we are not very high on that list, and that is our bad.
Yeah. Most definitely.
I don't know who they have in mind as secretary or in the key positions, but I know the numbers of people whose names have arisen. All of them, I think, share the same outlook in terms of where American higher education needs to go.
Yeah, I'll just toss this out there. Is that something you'd consider doing? I mean, you know these issues.
I think anyone who is committed to a better education system would want to be in a position to help make that happen. I think that the number of people out there who are highly qualified to take over the complexity of this is legion. There is no shortage of that. I think everyone who's committed to this, I mean, if I were called upon in any fashion to help make this happen, I think I would leap at the opportunity. So would anyone else similarly situated. Do I expect that? I would say most emphatically no. I think I'm at a point in my career where my best utility is in helping these things happen from the outside, and that's what I'm doing. I'm working now with a firm, Titan Partners, that is deeply committed to improving education at all levels. We've just established a Center for Higher Education Transformation that is aimed at helping public and independent colleges really prosper in a time that is going to continue to be challenging even without COVID. The economics of higher education, the challenges to higher education, particularly to private colleges, have been really severe over the past decade. I think that there's an obligation, not just for government, but for those outside of government, to do everything that we can to help institutions develop the capital, develop the resources, array that, intelligently acquire new opportunities, intelligently merge, intelligently develop new programs. That's what I'm focused on at this particular point in time.
Thank you. And I apologize. I just threw you a curveball on that one. So
if we are interrupted during this call and I say, good afternoon, Mr. President-elect, you'll understand.
I will understand for sure. So, Mike, what's next for you? You've moved from Cooley. You're working with Triton Partners, which is a wonderful firm. What's next?
Well, I have the amazing opportunity to be involved in transformation in the higher education field at exactly the point in history when that is probably the prime directive of just about every institution in the country. How does one transform itself to meet these changing demands? And I am very fortunate to be in the middle of that and to be working with an astonishingly smart and, I will say, humane group of people who share a really firm belief in the importance of quality higher education, of accessible higher education. And that's, to me, that's a highest calling. And of course, my grandbaby, who is 1 month away from being 2 years old, I want to make sure that when she goes to college, she has the best system in the universe.
Well, we all will celebrate that, and congratulations again on being a grandpappy.
Oh, indeed. That is the highest honor.
It certainly is. And so, Mike, thank you so much for being on the show. It's always a pleasure chatting with you, and I look forward to the next time we are able to get together.
Well, thank you, John.
Take care, my friend. Thanks for listening this week, and a special thank you to this week's special guest, Mike Goldstein, Managing Director of the Center for Higher Education Transformation at Titan Partners, and for his sharing his thoughts on the recent election and what's in store for higher ed under a Biden administration. I also want to give a special shout out to our sponsor, Perdea Education. Visit PerdeaEducation.com, that is PERDIA education.com, to learn how they can help you grow your online enrollment through a performance-based model that has no risk or long-term contracts to your institution.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drum McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.